Before we begin, I'd like to share our land acknowledgement. The Niagara Peninsula watershed is situated within the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Attawandaronk Neutral Anishinabeg, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, many of who continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, number 3, 4, and 381, and is within the land protected by the Dish in One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, the watershed is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Next slide, please. Today, we're hosting the session through Teams webinar, and there are a couple of functions that will be important for you as audience members. During the presentation this evening, we will pause and ask participants some poll questions. To initiate the poll function, please click on the polls icon along the top of your screen to open the polling questions on the right side of your screen. You can then provide your answers and view the results. Following the presentation this evening, there will be a question and answer period facilitated by Karen Wyanecki of Planning Solutions, Inc. To open the Q&A function, please click on the Q&A icon along the top of your screen to open the Q&A window at the right side of your screen. You can then type your questions here. We encourage you to submit your questions as they come to you during the presentation. Next slide. So let's test that poll function. So I'll give you a moment to find that poll icon at the top of your screen. Okay. And the first question to get us started this evening is, where are you joining us from? City of Hamilton, Haldimand County, Niagara Region, or another place? And feel free to specify where you're from in the Q&A window. Okay, so that's great. We've got a kind of split between Hamilton and Niagara Region. So that's great. Welcome, everyone. And let's move to the next slide. Okay, let's try one more question here. Please tell us about yourself. Okay, great. It looks like we have a good mix. Some residents, we have some consultants with us, some elected officials, representatives from the agricultural community. So we have a great cross section today joining us, and we look forward to your input and your questions for us. Next question, or next slide, please. Okay, great. Now let's discuss why we're here tonight. We're pleased to have the opportunity to share with you work that's underway at the Mpca. We're in the process of updating our policy document and developing for the first time a procedural manual. Updating the policy document and creating a procedural manual is a critical initiative for us as staff and for our board members. Having a clear, up-to-date, and appropriate set of environmental and planning policies is critical for carrying out our responsibilities associated with the review of requests for permits under the Conservation Authorities Act and our review role under the Planning Act. I'd like to take the opportunity first to introduce our team. At this time, I'd like to introduce David Deleuze, Senior Manager of Environmental Planning and Policy, who's also our project lead. I'd also like to introduce our two consultants who are working with us on this initiative. Karen Wyanecki is the Director of Practice for Planning Solutions, Inc. She worked with staff to prepare the policy document review in phase 1, which was a gap analysis, and she'll be leading the public and stakeholder engagement component and assisting us with the development of the new policy document and procedural manual. Providing expertise in buffers is Sal Spital, who is the principal and co-owner of North-South Environmental, Inc. Sal and his team are leading the work on the buffer width discussion paper and will advise staff on any revisions to the buffer policies and development of technical guidance documents related to buffers. So tonight we'll provide an overview of our project process and then do a deeper dive into the project. We've developed 2 discussion papers that are available on the Mpca website through the dedicated web portal. The first is a policy themes discussion paper, and the second is a discussion paper that focuses specifically on buffer widths. And we'd like to provide you with some background on the policy themes first, and then open a conversation up to allow you to answer questions to the project team at the end. Next slide, please. So shown here is a map of the Mpca watershed jurisdiction. Nope, there it is. Watershed is the land that drains into a particular watercourse, such as a stream, river, or lake. Gravity in the land's topography, being the high and low areas, move the water, rain, and snowmelt across the landscape from one area to the other. Our watershed encompasses 2,424 square kilometers, including the entire regional municipality of Niagara, portions of the city of Hamilton, about 21%, and Haldimand County, about 25% of their county. This area has been home to Indigenous peoples, a place for sharing, trading, hunting, gathering, stewardship, and friendship. Currently, the watershed supports a population of approximately 520,000 people. The watershed is uniquely situated between two Great Lakes, with the Niagara River as the boundary shared with the United States of America. As a result, the watershed includes several notable natural features, such as the Niagara Escarpment Biosphere, Niagara Falls, Wainfleet Bog, Balls Falls, Willoughby Marsh, and other significant landforms, such as the Fonthill-Kame Ice Contact Delta Complex. The unique microclimate created by the Niagara Escarpment and rich soils support one of Ontario's most productive agricultural systems, including vineyards, tender fruit and orchards, livestock, and various specialty crops, such as greenhouses for flowers, vegetables, sod farms, and mushroom farms. Slide, please. The Mpca was formed in 1959 under the authority of the Conservation Authorities Act and is one of 36 conservation authorities in the province of Ontario. We're governed by the Conservation Authorities Act, which is administered by the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. The Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry is responsible for the Conservation Authorities' activities related to natural hazard management. Further, the Conservation Authorities Act provides the legal basis for NPCA's mandate to undertake watershed-based planning and resource management programs that prevent, eliminate, or reduce the risk to life and property from flood and erosion hazards, as well as encourage the conservation and restoration of natural resources. Under the provisions of Section 8 of the Conservation Authorities Act, we administer the Development, Interference with Wetlands, and Alterations to Shorelines and Watercourses Regulation, also known as Ontario Regulation 15506. And it's under this regulation that we establish regulated areas in which permits may be required for certain activities. Proposed works that require permits must meet the 5 tests of the Act and regulation to ensure the control of flooding, erosion, dynamic beaches, or pollution, or the conservation of land is not affected by the development. We also have several other roles as a conservation authority. We have a delegated provincial interest responsibility under Section 3.1 of the PPS, which is natural hazards, and we act on behalf of the province when commenting on applications where there's provincial interest to natural hazards. For a resource management agency, we develop programs that reflect our local resource management needs within the watershed, and these are approved by our board of directors. We're also a commenting body under the Planning Act or other legislation, such as the Environmental Assessment Act and the Niagara Escarpment Act. We're a service provider with agreements with other levels of government, and we're also a landowner, and we may be involved as a proponent or as a landowner impacted by adjacent development. Next slide, please. The Mpca's permitting and policies were originally approved in September 2018 and took effect in November. It has been amended in June 2019, as well as again in May 2020 for housekeeping amendments. It's a compendium of our official opinion for the purposes of applying Ontario Regulation 15506. And we rely on the policies, and as does our board and those who are seeking permits from Mpca or looking for recommendations from Mpca in the case of Planning Act applications that are approved by our watershed municipalities. There are several areas within our policy document that do need updating based on change of corporate direction and objectives and vision through our new strategic plan, ongoing partner municipal official plan reviews, provincial legislation, or recent pending changes to the Conservation Authorities Act and related regulations. It's a combination of these factors that we're proceeding with a full review of the document. Our document's essential for providing our official opinions, and there is a requirement for a procedural manual to ensure consistency in administering the policies. Currently, many of our planning and permitting procedures are not well documented or haven't been documented at all yet. Having all applicable procedures recorded in one central document provides clarity for staff and customers on how our processes work. And the update is being undertaken in a manner that's consistent with the policies and procedures of the Conservation Authority plan review and permitting activities as guided by the Ministry of Natural Resources, as well as our strategic plan. Next slide. The first phase of our work was completed in March of this year, and we've proceeded to retain a consultant team, initiate the phase 2 of our work plan. Since then, we have developed an interim Section 28 EIS guideline, that's Environmental Impact Study Guideline, an interim wetland procedure document, and we've developed the 2 discussion papers that we will be discussing today. So we're now moving into the consultation and engagement component, and part of that is the public information session this evening. Following the engagement with our stakeholders and members of the community, we'll be assessing the input that we received and starting to prepare the new policy document and procedural manual and move forward with releasing drafts of those documents in the fall, offering another opportunity for consultation at that time, and then bringing it forward to our board of directors for approval by the end of the year. Next slide, please. As noted, this work is being completed in 2 phases. The first phase included a gap analysis to look at deficiencies and inconsistencies, and Karen Wyanecki assisted us with this work. While there were a number of findings that emerged from phase 1, along with recommendations to move forward with phase 2, it is important to note that some of the issues were minor and editorial in nature. Some of the issues focused on the need for new policies to address emerging issues such as climate change and green infrastructure. And some of the issues were more substantive from a policy and procedural perspective, such as buffers, which we'll be speaking to in more detail today. Importantly, the phase 1 concluded that the policy document offers a solid foundation for the authority to communicate and further articulate our corporate position on plan review and permitting. And the wording of the policies of our current document meet the intent of the provincial policy statement, and the wording meets the 5 tests of the permit application requirements under Section 28 of our regulation, or of the Conservation Authorities Act and our regulation. So the work we'll be presenting today builds upon the findings of the phase 1 work. So we'll be together until 8:30 this evening, and while our time may be limited, there are other opportunities for you to offer your input, such as completing the online digital survey that is posted on the Get Involved web portal, where you registered for this event, or providing detailed comments to our staff through our dedicated email address, and we'll remind you of that at the end of the presentation. Next slide. So why does this project and initiative matter to you? All our policies will be included in one document, and it will be up to date and reflective of the current provincial direction, policy, legislation, and regulations. The document will be used by Mpca to comment on planning applications submitted for approval to the Watershed Planning partners under the Planning Act, and review our permit applications submitted to us for a work permit under the Conservation Authorities Act. It will contain key policy opinion and information that may be interest to you as a landowner, community member, community leader, watershed partner, industry business owner, or consultant. Next slide, please. And with that, I would like to hand things over to Karen Wyanecki, who will briefly go through our purpose and objectives that we want to accomplish today. So over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Leilani, and good evening, everybody. I'm assuming everyone can hear and the audio is working well. We very much appreciate the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with you this evening and listening and learning from you. And so we would encourage you to use the Q&A component of the webinar and ensure that any questions you have are posted there, because once the presentation is complete, we will come back to those questions and make a commitment to ensure that they are properly answered. Next slide, please. And so really our purpose this evening is twofold. It is to present an overview of the phase 2 process, timing, and deliverables as identified by Leilani, to share with you some of the details of the policy themes discussion paper, and certainly to allow you to identify questions you may have in that regard, as well as to provide you with a deeper dive with respect to the issue of buffer widths, because during the phase 1 review the gap analysis and deficiencies component of this project, that was certainly one of the key areas that was noted as an area of top concern. And so, in addition to providing you with an overview, sharing some information with you about where we are at, it's early days and no decisions have been made. And we look to you for guidance, advice, input, and your comments and thoughts. And as Leilani mentioned, there will be a number of opportunities for you to provide your commentary either through the digital survey that is on the dedicated web portal or through the detailed comment options and the dedicated email. And we will come back to provide you with both of those coordinates at the conclusion of our meeting. However, in addition to providing you with information, tonight offers an important opportunity for us to secure some input from you about some of the critical areas, the governing fundamentals or common policy thematic areas that have been identified, the feature or resource specific policy themes, as well as some thoughts that you may have around implementation, customer and client service. And we will be moving forward to ask you a number of specific questions and polls so that we can assess exactly what your thoughts are and, of course, offer you an opportunity to identify any additional issues that are important to you. Next slide, please. And so our agenda is fairly straightforward. We're moving from the general to the specific. Leilani began with providing you with some introductory remarks, some outcomes from phase one. And I think it's important to reiterate at this point that the issues and thematic areas of concern that have been articulated both in the general themes policy discussion paper as well as the buffer widths discussion paper have not been selected at random. They emerged from phase one. And individually and collectively, we feel that by focusing on those issue areas, that it will offer comprehensive, but also policy clarification on a number of key issues that are important to NPCA and its partners. Currently, we're chatting a little bit about the two-way information exchange that tonight offers and the forum that this provides for you to identify some initial questions you may have. David Deleuze is going to provide an overview of the general policy themes discussion paper, and Sal Spitali will walk you through the buffer widths discussion paper. Next slide, please. And so without any further delay, it's my pleasure to hand the floor over and the microphone over to David Deleuze, who will walk you through the general policy themes discussion paper. David, the microphone is yours.
Thanks, Karen. So as Karen mentioned, I'll try and do this quickly. There's a lot of slides to go through, but go over the policy themes discussion paper. Next slide, please. So this slide is basically just a quick breakdown of the structure of the discussion paper. Along the bottom, you'll see the themes are organized into three different categories. So there's governing fundamentals, which apply throughout all of our policy document. There are feature or resource specific themes. And then finally, there's customer and client service related themes. Next slide, please. Okay, so just wanted to point out a couple of important points. Some of the policy themes relating to natural hazards that are technical in nature are not in the discussion paper. This is simply because there are specific technical guidelines from the province that must be followed when we deal with those, and we will be looking to those documents for that direction. So one specific example is the technical guide relating to lakeshore erosion management, which is currently being updated by the province. Once this guideline is updated, the NPCA will be looking to update its shoreline management plans, specifically the Lake Ontario Management Plan and the Lake Erie Management Plan. Once those management plans have been updated, if there's any further updates needed to the NPCA's policy resulting from those changes, there will be changes made to the policy to accommodate that. Next slide. So just briefly, these are the governing fundamentals themes. I won't go through all of them. The slide or the presentation will be made available on our portal page after the meeting, so you can look at it in more detail there. Next slide. Again, same thing with the feature or resource specific themes. Next slide, please. And last, the implementation and customers client service themes. Next slide, please. So the current policy document doesn't contain any detailed climate change policies. Instead, it provides only high-level reference to climate change, and it provides guidance for future, more detailed climate change work. Next slide, please. Now, there are some opportunities for the new policy document. So the NPCA's board declared a climate emergency, stressing the need for the NPCA to take action in the face of climate change. The NPCA's new strategic plan commits the NPCA to be a leader in research and innovation. And we also continue to update our floodplain mapping products, as well as any other products such as our shoreline management plans, all of which support the risk management approach to addressing climate change impacts. Now, going forward, the new policy document will need to have clear direction in areas such as future technical work, incorporating the impacts of climate change in mitigating risk, etc. Next slide. So, cumulative impacts. The current policy document doesn't have any clear direction for assessing cumulative impacts, nor does it provide any definition for cumulative impacts. Next slide. Now, the NPCA is in a good position to assess cumulative impacts as we look at land use changes and natural hazards on an ecosystem basis. So we're looking across political boundaries, across jurisdictional boundaries. We have also recently updated or developed interim EIS guidelines and a wetland procedure document that provide direction for evaluating cumulative impacts when undertaking EIS studies. So going forward, the new policy document will need to provide clear direction for assessing cumulative impacts from a proposed development. Next slide. So just wanted to highlight the interim EIS guidelines, which were approved by our board of directors back in June. Now, these resulted from a recommendation to our board in the form of the phase 1 gap analysis. They provide clear direction for applicants, consultants, landowners, etc., to determine when an EIS is required and the procedure for completing an EIS. It also explains the roles and responsibilities of the NPCA in relation to the EIS process. Next slide, please. So the NPCA's current policy document contains policies relating to reconfiguration or compensation for non-provincially significant wetlands. Now, this policy is only used when there is no reasonable alternative to locate development outside of a non-PSW. And when we apply this policy, the goal is to achieve an ecological net gain. The NPCA developed an interim wetland procedure document to give guidance on the NPCA requirements when using this policy. Next slide, please. So there are some opportunities here with this. Now, while it's not explicitly noted in our current policy, NPCA staff have been applying a protection hierarchy when considering the reconfiguration of a non-PSW. So in other words, you have to start with if somebody's proposing compensation or wants to reconfigure a wetland, first you have to ensure that the development can't be accommodated in some other fashion. And then you work your way eventually to you exhaust all options and determine that, okay, there's no possible way that reconfiguration can be avoided. Now, when we deal with the reconfiguration proposals, it's important to note that our position has always been that applying this policy has been that monetary compensation for wetland removal or stream realignment is not a form of mitigation. So in other words, you can't use that to achieve net gain. Now, going forward, the new policy document will need to provide clear direction for considering the use of mitigation through reconfiguration and recreation of features for ecological net gain. And in particular, in the case of an approved environmental assessment or a minister's zoning order, that potentially could include monetary compensation. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides. Next slide. The interim wetland procedure document, this resulted, again, similar to the EIS guidelines, a recommendation to our board during the phase 1 gap report. And it outlines the process and the study requirements for wetland identification, evaluation, study, protection, and enhancement. Next slide, please. All right, so intensification. Um, Everybody's heard this, or density increase, accommodating growth targets. All of these fall under this umbrella of intensification. Now, upper and single tier municipalities have recently updated their official plans to conform with the provincial growth plan. The deadline for that was July 1st. And basically, the growth plan promotes intensification, maximize your density within your urban areas. Now, the NPCA's current document is silent on the different forms of development that would support intensification and could potentially be located in regulated areas. Next slide, please. Now, for opportunities, there is going to be a lot more pressure for development in urban areas through intensification, and this will lead to pressure on areas that are susceptible to erosion and/or flooding. Now, the NPCA has an important role to play in reviewing such proposals. As Leilani mentioned earlier, we do have a delegated role it's now under one of our regulations to comment on hazards, specifically under the provincial policy statement on behalf of the province. So going forward, the new policy document will need to provide clear guidance for considering permission, so an NPCA permit, of development that is intended to support municipal growth targets. This will also need to be coupled with a high quality pre-consultation process where applicants and municipalities, or with applicants and municipalities, that outlines permit application requirements when infill development is being proposed. Next slide, please. So minister zoning orders, MZOs. Long story short is our current document is silent on MZOs and how to deal with those. Next slide. Now, there were recent amendments to the Conservation Authorities Act that requires conservation authorities to issue a permit where the province has approved an MZO. One of the opportunities here for the Conservation Authority is while we have to approve the permit, we do have the ability to impose conditions on the permit. There are appeal rights to the conditions, but it's a little more than just simply you file an appeal and you get your permit. So again, it's an opportunity there. Going forward, there'll need to be clear procedures for commenting on municipal MZO requests, and there will also need to be clear policies for the use of mitigation measures with MZOs. So again, the Conservation Authority has to approve a permit where an MZO is involved, but as part of the conditions, that's where we could get into the possibility of requiring financial compensation if there's no alternative to avoid development within the feature. So next slide, which I believe is another poll question. So I think Karen was going to handle that one.
So we would like to ask for your perspective and opinion on this particular question. So where there is an approved environmental assessment or a minister's zoning order that results in the removal of regulated features and areas such as wetlands, do you support the use of mitigation through reconfiguration and recreation of features for ecological net gain, or where mitigation cannot be achieved, the consideration of monetary compensation? So could I give you a moment to read that question and share your thoughts, and we will bring the results up on the screen to share with you. Give you a few moments. We won't spend a lot of time on the poll. We will simply continue to move forward. And certainly at this time, again, we reiterated before, but it is worth mentioning again. If you have a particular question, please use the Q&A function to ensure that your question is brought to our attention. And following the presentation of material to you, we'll make a commitment to ensure that all of your questions are answered. And David, thank you very much for your response to question or poll number 3. David, back to you.
Okay, next slide, please. So our current policy document provides or identifies the various role that NPCA plays. We have a number of different roles. So we're a regulatory authority. We require permits or can issue permits or permissions when someone wants to develop within a regulated area. We're a representative of the province for Section 3.1 of the Provincial Policy Statement. We're a natural resource or a resource management agency. We're a public commenting body under the Planning Act. We're a service provider for municipalities through MOUs, and Conservation Authority is also a landowner. Next slide, please. So there's a number of opportunities to help educate the public on what the Conservation Authority does. So the Conservation Authority, the NPCA, is involved in a number of different processes, Planning Act processes, environmental assessments, Niagara Escarpment Commission development permits, etc. And so going forward, the new policies need to identify the NPCA's role under the various different legislative processes and also identify who does what among the different agencies. There's a lot of confusion around what exactly the Conservation Authority's role is in commenting, whether we're supposed to be commenting on endangered species or other features, but what other levels of government or other government agencies, what their role is compared to NPCA. Next slide.
Thank you, David. We have an opportunity to ask you another polling question, and this relates very importantly to information that we would like to know from you related to NPCA. So, as David said, having an affirmed understanding of the role and the responsibilities of the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority is critical. And so we would like to ask you this polling question. What additional information would you like to know about NPCA? Would you like additional information about NPCA's role in permitting, plan review, additional programs or services that NPCA offers, more information about application requirements, how NPCA works in collaboration with its watershed municipal partners, who is responsible for what across the watershed, or perhaps there is another area that you would like more information on. May I provide you with an opportunity to take a few moments to consider what additional information you might like to receive about NPCA and provide your response to the poll. We'll give you a few minutes and then we will bring the results up on the screen. And thank you in advance for your time this evening and also for your commitment and your interest. So we see that there are some thoughts around role in permitting. What is NPCA's role in permitting? And we thank you very much for sharing some of those thoughts with us. We see that there are several folks in attendance who would like a variety of information. And this is very helpful moving forward, not just for this particular initiative, but certainly when NPCA is looking at ensuring that there is a broad level of understanding about its roles and responsibilities. So thank you to all who took the time to respond. David, back to you.
So stormwater management, the current NPCA policy document does have some references to stormwater and the NPCA's role, but there's no clear policies or no guide for how to review permit applications for stormwater management facilities that are affected by NPCA features. Next slide. So there is an opportunity to clarify the NPCA's role in stormwater review, particularly where there are facilities in regulated areas and cumulative impacts that need to be factored into the development. Include, sorry here. There also needs to include policies and technical guidance for the NPCA to advocate for the integration of sustainable technologies and green infrastructure in site designs. Next slide, please. Now, with respect to watershed and subwatershed planning, the current policy document describes the NPCA's integrated watershed management approach to planning. But it doesn't provide clear direction or any direction really for the role the NPCA plays in the new watershed, sub-watershed framework that was introduced by the province through the updated growth plan. Next slide, please. Now, opportunities. Again, there's emphasis in the growth plan and provincial policy statement about the need for watershed planning to inform land use planning. And with recent updates to municipal, specifically upper tier and single tier official plans, there's requirements in those documents for watershed plans or sub-watershed planning to inform decisions on land use planning. Now, the NPCA is committed through its 10-year strategic plan to implement a proactive sub-watershed work program and to implement and inform the quaternary and sub-watershed planning for growth areas within our jurisdiction. So the opportunity within the policy document moving forward is to clarify our role as a resource management agency, as a regulatory authority, and a service provider in the new sub-watershed watershed planning framework, and how we do that as a resource management agency. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on now to the feature or resource specific policy themes. Next slide. So with respect to agriculture, our current policy document does recognize that there needs to be a healthy balance between, or sustainable balance between agriculture, environmental, social, and economic priorities. Our current policy document does identify agricultural uses that do not require NPCA work permits. And it also notes that there are certain value-added or agritourism uses, agricultural uses, activities that require a building permit and still may require an NPCA work permit, depending on the nature and scale of the proposal. Next slide. So opportunities. Again, our watershed in Niagara is a very unique and important agricultural area. We have rich soils, supports one of Ontario's most productive agricultural systems, the tender fruit and grapes. Official plans are being updated at the local level and will include or reflect new and amended provincial agricultural policies. So moving forward, the NPCA will need to examine our policies to determine whether clarification is needed to support the agricultural industry with respect to permitted agricultural uses or agricultural related uses and on-farm diversified uses within our regulated areas in accordance with the local official plan policies. Next slide. And again, I'll pass it over to Karen for the poll question.
Thank you, David. And so we have two questions back to back that relate to the current agricultural policies that are in the existing NPCA policy document. And we would like at this time to invite those who are joining this evening to take this poll and indicate from your perspective, are NPCA current agricultural policies supportive of the agricultural industry? Yes, no, or I don't know. And may I give you an opportunity to provide your response, and then we will pull up the results in a moment or two. Several of you indicated you don't know. All right, good enough. Let me move forward and let me ask you a second polling question specifically related to agriculture. And the polling question is as follows. Do the current policies from your perspective need to be clarified with respect to permitted uses, agricultural related uses, and on-farm diversified uses within the NPCA regulated areas in accordance with updated municipal official plan policies and the 5 tests of the Conservation Authorities Act and Ontario Regulation 15506? Yes, they need to be clarified. No, they do not need to be clarified, or I don't know. And again, may we invite you to share your response with us. Do they need to be clarified? Yes. We've heard from 2 of you. Thank you very much. And so we thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor back, or the microphone rather, back to you, David, to continue with the resource-specific thematic issues and areas of focus.
Now, a big issue with the NPCA's policy document that was flagged previously by our board are our buffer policies. Hence why we did a specific discussion paper on buffers. Now, the current policy document does have specific policies related to buffer widths for different regulated features and areas. There is, however, inconsistency in the buffer requirements. So the two sections there that are cited basically show that you could potentially allow major development to have a potentially smaller buffer than a smaller scale development. Next slide. Now, back in December of 2021, our board directed staff to propose amendments to our policies to set minimum 30-meter buffers for natural hazards, wetlands, and watercourses, and to review the policy regarding exceptions to reductions in those buffers. So work is underway to address this board direction through the buffer width discussion paper, which will be coming up shortly. We'll discuss that. Next slide. Natural heritage features in areas other than NPCA regulated features. So the policy document is silent with respect to other natural heritage features. So areas of natural and scientific interest, habitat of endangered or threatened species, significant woodlands, significant wildlife habitat, etc. Next slide. So there are opportunities for the new policy document with respect to this. We do have a section in the current document that identifies or provides guidance for the different study requirements that may be required as part of a permit or a planning application. Most of the natural heritage features that we mentioned on the previous slide are protected and managed through municipal official plans and provincial plans. There are MOUs that we have with our partner municipalities, and in each case, those MOUs do allow for us to comment on the impacts to natural heritage features in areas within regulated areas as it relates to ecological function of the regulated feature. Municipalities review planning applications for impact on natural heritage features in areas within their natural heritage system. So moving forward, there's an opportunity for us to clarify in our policy document and our procedural manual the roles and responsibility under plan review MOUs with our partner municipalities and provide guidance for reviewing planning applications in relation to other natural heritage features in areas outside of regulated areas. Next slide.
Thank you, David. Now, this poll question, we would like to ask you the following. Should the new policy document explain who is responsible for natural heritage features and areas beyond NPCA regulated features? Yes, no, or I don't know. If you might be kind enough to take a moment or two and share your thoughts with us, I will then share the detailed results on the screen. And so there seems to be overwhelming support for reference to be included in the new policy document, and we thank each of you for having taken the opportunity to provide that clarity and direction for us. David, back to you.
Okay, next slide, please. So moving on to the last theme category, implementation and customer client services. Next slide. So the current policy document does provide, again, as I mentioned earlier, guidance for the studies that we may require as part of our application. Our current strategic plan and Conservation Ontario Climate Service document commits the Mpca to maintaining a high standard of client services. So we're committed to continuous improvement, refining the decision support tools for efficient application management and review, enhancing customer service, and communicating the role and responsibility of the Mpca in our plan review and permitting functions. Next slide. So again, we are committed to maintaining a high standard of client services, tools and procedures for planning review and for permits. We need to make sure that we are developing or adopting tools and standards to effectively implement our policies. So for example, we've done that already with our Interim Eis Guidelines and Wetland Procedures document. And again, just making sure that all parties have the right tools and access to updated standards and procedures will help support efficient policy implementation. Next slide.
Thank you, David. So we would like to ask you a very important question. All of the questions are important, but can NPCA do more to improve the level of service? Yes, no, or I don't know. And then we will follow this polling question with a deeper dive and ask you about the improvements that, from your perspective, you believe need to be made. Take a moment, please, to provide your thoughts. And I will share the details of your individual responses on the screen. Thank you. So we do have one response from Linda, thank you, yes, and one response from member Halinga, I don't know. And so we thank you very much for taking the time to respond appropriately. Next slide, please. So may we ask you this polling question, building on the last. What, from your lens, in terms of improvements, need to be made? Should the improvements focus on ensuring the policy is driven by science when available? Should NPCA publish up-to-date policies that are easily accessible for all, by all? Should NPCA develop and utilize a decision support tool for establishing buffer widths? And you're going to hear a little bit more about the use of decision support tools and buffers in particular when Sal Spitali walks you through the buffer widths discussion paper. Should NPCA be creating stronger partnerships with watershed municipalities? Should NPCA be working more closely with other partners? Or perhaps there is another area from your lens where NPCA could improve the level of service that it offers. And if you'd be kind enough to take the opportunity to share your thoughts, I will bring the results, detailed results, individual results up on the screen. I'll give you a few more minutes to think about that in the event that there are responses that you would like to share with us. Thank you very much. So we're seeing a variety of responses here that focus on up-to-date policies that are easily accessible, creating stronger partnerships, ensuring that policy is driven by science when that is available, and certainly developing and utilizing a decision support tool for establishing buffer width. So thank you to everyone who has taken the time to share their thoughts. And David, with that, I'm going to turn the microphone back to you.
Thank you, Karen. And actually with that, next slide, please. I will now pass the presentation over to Sal to go over the buffer discussion paper with you. Sal?
Great. Thanks, David, and good evening, everybody. The staff were asked to consider a 30-meter buffer to regulated features and areas. And through the phase 1 report, there was a consideration and comparison of some of the buffer widths that were identified in other Conservation Authority documents. And with that, the phase 1 report recommended that a buffer width technical discussion paper should be prepared to determine if and how buffer widths would be prescribed in the updated policy document. So with that, I've been working with Mpca and helped author a buffer width discussion paper where the purpose was to undertake a technical analysis of buffers, review best practices, undertake a jurisdictional review of policies related to buffer widths, as well as review decision support tools that would be used to inform the determination of appropriate buffer widths. Next slide, please. And I thought it might be important to take a moment to talk a bit about buffers, or some also use the term, and in certain policy documents, vegetation protection zones. They're synonymous with each other, and how those compare or differ from the term setback. Conservation authority policies often and regularly use the term setback, where setback is technically defined as a physical separation or distance of development or a structure from a feature or hazard. So with a setback, it's not necessarily intended to mitigate impacts to natural features and ecological functions. Typically, there's no requirement for natural self-sustaining vegetation. It's literally a separation between a structure or development and a feature or hazard. That differs from buffers, where they're traditionally considered naturally vegetated areas of land located adjacent to natural heritage or regulated features, and bordering lands that are subject to development or site alteration. So buffers can be part of a setback. And so this illustration here is just giving a conceptual look at how buffer may be contained within the regulated area, within which also setbacks would be or are identified. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a buffer between a residential development and a natural feature or hazard. And so this is showing shortly after development, the landscaping and planting of vegetation within the buffer, and the rear yards are delineated by a fence. Beyond that is the buffer to the feature. And in this case, and the intention of a buffer is that it's not to be a part of the feature, rather it's to be, it acts as a form of mitigation to protect the feature and its ecological functions. Next slide, please. So one of the aspects of our review is looking at the science informing ecologically appropriate buffers. What we found through that review is there's actually limited scientific study of buffers specifically in terms of their effectiveness and how they function to protect the feature and its functions. For example, mitigating impacts to water quality to wetlands. And in fact, wetlands and watercourses are the primary types of studies where they look at those features and the effectiveness of buffers. Other studies look at how far impacts extend into features. For example, noise, light, predation, those sorts of things, but not necessarily how a buffer mitigates the impacts of those into a feature. But that can be used as a surrogate to tell you how far impacts may extend. It could inform how wide a buffer may be. So it is certainly conclusive that we found there's a wide range of extensive impacts and effectiveness of buffer widths, depending on the feature and the type of impacts. And so what we have in terms of using science-based justification for buffers, it's open to scrutiny from both those looking for a wider buffer, where you can look at the literature that identifies wider buffers as being effective, versus other studies and those that find smaller buffers may be effective, which may benefit their objective in what they may be considering. So again, with the scientific literature, where we do know and we have widely accepted ecological concepts and principles, wider is generally better. The denser vegetation, the better at mitigating impacts. We do know that the feature type, or the sensitivity of the feature, and the type of adjacent land use, or the potential for impacts, informs how wide or how effective a buffer may be, as well as considerations for slopes and soils that may affect or impact the effectiveness of the buffer. So with respect to the definition of buffers, they're typically defined to describe their composition, that they're to be vegetated. Definitions often describe the purpose of a buffer and the role of a buffer in mitigating impacts. Next slide, please. In the jurisdictional scan of policy documents, and we looked at both conservation authority policy documents as well as municipal official plans, both at a upper tier, lower tier, or single tier level. Buffers are widely accepted and often required in policy. Most policy documents do require buffers and fewer, but many do prescribe buffer widths. Where buffer widths are prescribed in planning and policy documents, they vary in their width depending on the feature type and sensitivity of the ecological functions, as one may expect. Buffer widths tend to be informed by the vision, goals, and objectives and principles established in policies and strategic plans. And by that, I mean where your objectives have perhaps require a higher level of confidence and protection of features, you may see higher buffers widths prescribed in policy to help achieve those objectives. Policies often permit refinement to buffer widths, and they may be a reduction or an increase. And they also allow for some compatible uses within the buffers. Those may be trails, for example, and they tend to be low impact trails, recreational trails. While some guidance documents do provide minimum recommended buffers, all guidance documents recognize that buffer widths can be refined, and that's an important distinction or finding that we had for our through our review. And we've also found a lot of commentary that talks about a one-size-fits-all approach to prescribing buffers is generally not preferred or recommended. There's also general consensus that some types of uses may be permitted, as I mentioned, and the type of permitted uses, as well as the type of flexibility or refinement that is allowed to occur to a buffer width, would be informed by an environmental impact study or something similar. Next slide, please. So with respect to how buffer widths are determined, they're typically determined based on several factors, including the sensitivity of the feature and the ecological functions, the potential impact of the adjacent land use, biophysical factors of the adjacent land uses, such as slopes, where a steeper slope into the feature, there would be less time for water to infiltrate or for vegetation to scrub out or filter out sediments and pollutants or excess nutrients. Other mitigating factors are also important in determining a buffer width, such as fencing, where a fence may provide an important role in preventing encroachment, dumping, those sorts of things, where a buffer also plays an important role, but a fence acts as a more obvious barrier to prevent those sorts of impacts from extending into a feature, impacting a feature. And buffers, as I mentioned earlier, they're always typically informed by environmental studies. It's not often that there's buffers that are identified where there's an opportunity through an environmental study to at least examine those. Next slide, please. So while there is no consistently applied buffer width to features that I mentioned earlier, there are some consistent buffer widths that are applied to regulated features, and that we most commonly found, where it would be 15 meters for warm water or intermittent streams, 30 meters for cool or cold water and permanent streams, 15 meters for non-provincially significant wetlands, 30 meters for provincially significant wetlands and locally significant wetlands, 10 to 15 meters for valley lands, 30 meters for shorelines, lakes, and water bodies. Next slide, please. So again, with our review, we found that an important factor when prescribing buffer widths would be to ensure an objective and consistent approach is followed. So from a reviewing agency or approval agency's perspective, there needs to be some sort of consistent and objective approach. For the benefit of both an applicant or the consultants undertaking a study and the reviewing or approval agency, a decision support tool or some form of detailed guidance document, such as guidance provided through an EIS guideline document, is important and should be provided. Where a decision support tool is identified, it should follow what we found to be a risk-based approach. And what we mean by that is a risk of impacting a feature or the risk of a type of development having an impact on a feature and its functions. So a more sensitive feature may be considered high risk, or a more impactful type of development, such as high density residential, may be considered high risk to the feature. So with that the risk-based approach considers, again, the sensitivity of the feature, potential for impacts, and it also factors in biophysical characteristics and other mitigating factors. For example, again, use of a fence to help enhance the mitigating ability of the fence and the buffer to protect the feature and its ecological functions. Next slide, please. So with respect to our conclusions and our recommendations, we found that buffers should be prescribed in policy. And this is an important recommendation and conclusion that we came to. And this is based on the jurisdictional review, as well as a review of best practices. There's often disagreement between applicants and approval authorities over what is considered an ecologically appropriate buffer width. I mentioned earlier, this is in part due to the lack of definitive science and the variability in effectiveness of buffer widths, the features and functions. And so it becomes a challenge to come to some consensus or agreement on what is an ecologically appropriate buffer. Therefore, the recommendation we have is that buffer widths and policies are prescribed, but they factor in achieving objectives or targets. They're clear, and that they also policies, because of the jurisdictional review, should also provide some flexibility to ensure that buffer width refinements are evaluated through an environmental impact study. With that, we're also recommending that if there were to be prescribed buffers and any flexibility provided, there be a decision support tool to inform those decisions with respect to any refinements, increases or decreases, and that decision support tool be very descriptive in a way and provide sufficient direction to ensure an objective and consistent approach to identifying an appropriate and effective buffer width. There's two approaches to prescribing buffers and policies, and those are some of the questions that we're considering. It's do you apply a minimum buffer width where there's no opportunity for reduction of the width, but it would be increased through an environmental impact study, for example, through applying a decision support tool? Or do you have a robust buffer width as a starting point that can be reduced or potentially even increased, but that would be supported by an evaluation completed through an environmental impact study, and again, with a direction provided in a decision support tool? So with that, I thank you for your time, and I will pass it back over to Karen, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sal. Next slide, please. So I believe we have a 10th polling question to ask you. So you've heard from Sal and members of his team who have undertaken a comprehensive and a robust jurisdictional and good practices review, but we'd like to hear from you. From your perspective, should the new policy document contain prescribed policies relating to buffers? Yes, no, or I don't know. May I invite you to share your thoughts? And while I have your attention, may I also invite you to take the opportunity to use the Q&A tool as part of our connection this evening, our web connection this evening, and ask questions that are top of mind for you, because we will be moving into a facilitated dialogue, and the questions that you share with us will form the focus and the dialogue for that component of our meeting. So should the new policy document contain prescribed policies relating to buffers? Yes, no, or I don't know. Let's see the response. And thank you. So 2 yeses and 1 I don't know. And so we thank you very much to those who have taken the time to respond. Next slide, please. This is another polling question related to the last, but perhaps a deeper dive. If you support prescribed buffer policies, and there were 2 of you who responded yes and 1 who said I don't know. So if you are thinking about this, and if you support the notion of prescribed buffer policies, would you recommend that NPCA adopt a policy approach that focuses on A, B, or C below? So would you recommend that NPCA adopt a policy approach that specifies minimum buffer widths with no opportunity to reduce the width, but it could be increased through an environmental study? Or would you recommend prescribed buffer policies that offer robust or specify robust buffer widths that could be reduced or increased with support from an environmental study, or none of the above? So may I ask you to take the opportunity to share your thoughts with us, and I will bring those results up on the screen. So David, thank you. Minimum buffer width with no opportunity to reduce the width, but could be increased through an environmental study. 1 response. While we're giving you an opportunity to ask questions or share your comments or thoughts, what we would like to know is what policy theme is most important to you, and I believe we have a polling question to that effect. Thank you. And the question is this: from your individual perspective, and what we've been able to do is walk you through a number of policy thematic areas that emerged in phase 1. What policy theme is most important to you? Climate change, cumulative impacts, urban intensification, watershed and subwatershed planning, buffers, ecological net gain, stormwater management, low impact development and green infrastructure, public education and awareness of roles and responsibilities, application requirements, agriculture, natural heritage features and areas, or policy implementation, customer and client service. So could I give you an opportunity just to share your thoughts on the area that is most important to you: urban intensification, natural heritage features and areas? You know, when I look at the diversity of responses here, it certainly speaks to the range of interests and areas of focus, but certainly also the opportunity areas for NPCA to focus on with respect to the new policy document. So we do have 1 question that has come through, and that question is this: the buffer width decision support tool, who uses this and who monitors the results of the assessment? And so I believe that that may be a question that perhaps would be first responded to by Leilani and David, and then perhaps by Sal, as he has undertaken a variety of research initiatives in this area. So without any further delay, I'm going to mute my microphone, and I'm going to turn the floor over, Leilani, to you. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Karen, and David, thank you for the question. I would see the buffer width support tool being used by both Conservation Authority staff in conjunction with the consultant who's working on behalf of the applicant to work together to scope what's required in the application of that support tool and the outcome to identify what's additional study or information would be required to make the determination of whether a buffer width could be increased or decreased going through a risk assessment process. And who would monitor the results of the assessment? I think it would be similar to our process in looking at other technical information that would be submitted. Is that information would be submitted to our Mpca technical team comprised of planning ecologists to review that information and to work with the applicant's consultant on the findings of any information that's submitted under that tool. But I'll also turn it over to Sal, who's had much experience working with these types of decision support tools.
Thanks, Leilani. No, that's a great question. Typically, the decision support tool provides that direction and that guidance, and the evaluation through using that is provided or included in, for example, an environmental impact study. So within the environmental impact study, you would have gone through the steps to look at the sensitivity of the feature, and its risk assessment is a high risk feature because it's highly sensitive, and you apply that risk-based approach to the type of development or adjacent land use that's being proposed, the potential for impact, and through applying the decision support tool, you would come out with an outcome of what the appropriate buffer width should be. And like the rest of the environmental impact study, that would get evaluated by the NPCA to determine if it was applied appropriately, and the conclusions were based on the information that was obtained through the EIS. And again, that buffer using the decision support tool was correctly applied. But then Leilani answered the question with respect to who monitors the results. But again, that with it being included in an EIS, it would be the approval authorities that would be reviewing that to determine if it was completed properly. Thanks for your question.
So thank you very much. I believe we have an additional question and comment, Linda, from you, and one that has just come in from Dave. From Linda, please remember in all you do that provincial policy statement is a very low bar. We need NPCA to do much better. Is this part of the plan? In other words, will the policies establish, I believe, Linda, what you are suggesting is a higher bar than that established through the provincial policy statement. And I'm going to turn the microphone over to Leilani to address that particular question and comment specifically. Thank you. Leilani.
Thank you, Karen, and Linda, thank you for the question. You're correct in that the policies in the provincial policy statement are a minimum, and municipalities can choose to go above those policies in terms of setting perhaps higher protection standards as long as they don't conflict with other policies in the plan. From our perspective in the PPS, what we're looking at is section 3.1, the hazard management component. That's where we have delegated provincial responsibility. And yes, that is those are policies that we need to ensure are incorporated into our policy document. And through our strategic plan process, we did identify the need to be leaders in innovation when it comes to climate change, when it comes to promoting low impact development and green structure through stormwater management and a plan review and looking at impacts on our regulated features and how it may affect natural hazards. So we are looking at it from that perspective, if that's addressing your question. And as David noted through the presentation, there are opportunities that we're seeing to put forward policies that would enable us to work with our municipal partners to support them in their plan review and also bring forward innovative solutions and ideas through the plan review process. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Leilani. And so I do believe we have some additional suggestions, comments, and thoughts that are coming forward. What changes to floodplain mapping have been incorporated by knowledge of climate change? And so that is an important, very important and critical initiative, and segues to the point that Leilani has just raised about NPCA being an innovative leader with respect to climate change and low impact development and green infrastructure. And so without any further delay, Leilani, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Dave, for the question. Currently, we're updating our Big Forks and Beaver Creek floodplain mapping, and we are looking at what an increase to precipitation may mean to those floodplain limits. I must admit there's not much guidance that's come out of the province in terms of how do we account for the impacts of climate change on floodplain mapping or natural hazards. So that is an area that we will need to take a look at as part of future study and work. We're also forming a research team within the NPCA to look at climate change research in conjunction with our municipal partners and start looking at what those impacts on the watersheds mean and how we should best manage those from a natural hazard perspective, but also from a natural resource management perspective.
Thank you, Leilani, and thank you for the question. The next comment has come forward from Linda. Thank you. Presentation never once used the term system with respect to natural heritage, only used the word feature. The closest presenters came was cumulative impact. Hopefully systems will be the approach. And Leilani, may I turn the microphone back to you to address this particular comment? And thank you, Linda.
Thank you, Linda, for the question. Yes, definitely we take a systems approach at the NPCA in looking at the natural heritage system. We also look at ecological function and cumulative impacts on a system base. And the wetland procedure document and the interim EIS guidelines provides further guidance on that for the need to look at that cumulative impact. So taking a look at hydrological impacts and ecological impacts together and the impacts to the system and the function is what we have included in those interim guidelines, and we welcome comments on those as well because we'll be looking to incorporate them into the final procedural manual at the end of the day, and we think we're on the right track and moving forward with those guidelines at this time, but of course we welcome your input.
Thank you, Leilani. There is also a question that has been raised around minister's zoning orders and the potential impact on sensitive areas. And David, thank you for this question, which reads as follows. The provincial government with its new growth targets want development applications to move forward quickly. How will the NPCA fit MZOs that threaten I believe, fight MZOs that threaten sensitive areas? And so again, I'm going to turn the floor back to Leilani to respond specifically to this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Dave, for another great question. We're definitely seeing in the conservation world many MZOs that are coming forward as requests and getting approved that impact natural heritage features and areas as well as regulated features and areas. And through this work, we have reached out to some of our conservation partners to understand what they're experiencing over in their jurisdiction. And what we are hearing and what we're discussing is the need to ensure that we have set policies and processes in place for when these requests come forward to municipalities so that we can act quickly to identify what our concerns are and identify what we would be requiring in terms of technical work should an MZO move forward. And again, thinking of cumulative impacts, a protection hierarchy, trying to ensure features are protected. But unfortunately, at the end of the day, the MZO process was put in place by the province through legislation for a reason, to get approvals that don't need to conform to official plan policies, and that we would be then compelled to issue permits as a result of approved MZOs. However, we do have in our legislation our ability to condition those permits and put in place the technical work we would require to look at our interests under our 5 tests of our Conservation Authorities Act. So it is a new process to us, and we want to ensure that we're well equipped and there's a clear understanding of our role in it and what our requirements would be moving forward with minister's zoning orders.
Thank you, Leilani. The next point, or the next comment, question that has been raised, the term net gain is translated as biodiversity offsetting in Niagara. And this comes to us from Linda. Thank you. Please tell us you intend to finally just say no to that as a too low provincial bar you intend to rise above. Thank you for your answers. So may I turn the microphone over, Leilani, to you to respond to the issue that Linda has raised and the clarification she is seeking.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Linda. We do recognize that this is a very controversial policy in our document, and we're being upfront and looking at reviewing it and asking the community and stakeholders, should this policy remain? And also, how, if it is to remain, how do we ensure that it's applied in a way that would have a benefit at the end of the day in terms of any recreation or reconfiguration of a feature, or in the cases of a minister's zoning order or through an approved environmental assessment processes that aren't within our jurisdiction to approve. However, we have a strong role as a regulatory authority and a commenting body that we can assert ourselves in that process to ensure that should features be removed, there's going to be expectations on what that means in terms of replacing features and ensuring that it has meaningful ecological function within our system.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Leilani. Thank you to all who have raised questions. Does anybody else have any additional thoughts, comments, or observations to share? Any comments, observations, or thoughts to share? And so perhaps at this time, what I will do is just bring to your attention the fact that it's extremely important that NPCA hear from you. Our session this evening offered an opportunity, and I see, David, that you've shared an additional thought or comment with us, and I will come back to that. May I just draw your attention to the online survey? We would really like your input through the digital survey. You can also provide detailed comments if that happens to be an easier process for you. A copy of the public information session will be posted on the project online portal, and deadline for comments is September the 9th. Let me come back to the comments or observations. David, you said, can the NPCA build more teeth in their updated policy to deal with their EIS recommendations to ensure all recommendations are fulfilled prior to any work proceeding? And I believe that that is most appropriately addressed by Leilani. Leilani, floor is yours.
Thank you, David, for the question. We are looking at our EIS guidelines in terms of reference, as we noted, and I welcome you to take a look at that. We have identified through that process the requirements for scoping environmental impact assessments, the requirements for submissions that they're fulsome and complete, and that there's requirements for ensuring that the recommendations are met to our satisfaction, and that we sign off and approve those studies, and that there is a follow-up and a monitoring component as well as part of the applications and the EIS recommendations. And we're also looking at how our policies could be strengthened or enhanced to ensure that the recommendations that come out of the EIS in accordance with those guidelines and our technical requirements from our staff are implemented through the permitting and planning process. And as I noted, we welcome you to take a look at those online, and anybody else on the call, and offer their comments on it, because we do want to make that part of our final procedural manual.
Any additional comments or thoughts or questions that may not have been raised or by you before, or may not have been answered in the context of the dialogue that we've shared with you? I do recognize that it is, thank you very much for all your responses. It's appreciated. David, thank you very much for your comments. You know, having an opportunity to share some time, listen and learn from you, and I certainly have indeed had an opportunity to hear from you in terms of the polling and some of the responses that you have kindly shared with us. But when we convene meetings like this, it's my pleasure at this time to offer a very brief recap of what I believe I've heard. Now, I can't do justice to all of the thoughts and comments that were shared from the time we began the Public Information Center session this evening. But what I can share with you are some of the key learnings that really are top of mind from my lens, those nuggets of knowledge or pearls of wisdom that dropped in the context of our time together. And perhaps I'll just take a few moments to highlight those. So the first pearl of wisdom or key learning is that this is an initiative that is critical to the NPCA board and to staff, but also critical for watershed municipalities, organized stakeholders, and members of the public who are interested as landowners, environmental representatives, agricultural representatives, and community leaders and the like. And we certainly thank you for being here. Secondly, two discussion papers, as we noted at the very outset, have been developed and are available for access through the dedicated NPCA web portal. There is an opportunity for you to offer additional comments, as noted on the screen right now, through the digital survey or through detailed comments. And again, you have the link available to you and also available on the dedicated web portal. I will remind you the deadline for comments is September the 9th. We look forward to hearing back from you. With respect to the general policy themes discussion paper, I believe you heard that there are three categories of themes or issue areas. One, focusing on governing fundamentals like climate change and cumulative impacts, stormwater management, LID, green infrastructure, and the like. Those are common elements that tie those issues together. Second, David presented some specific policy and resource specific issues like agriculture, buffers, and the like. And thirdly, the third category or thematic area focused on policy implementation, customer service, and those process-related issues around delivering quality service to those NPCA serves. From a buffer widths perspective, Sal provided some opportunities, some details around the work that he has done on behalf of NPCA. He noted that there is limited scientific study of buffers, but that there are several general ecological concepts, including wider is better, denser vegetation is better, and that the sensitivity and adjacent land uses has an impact on how wide the buffer is. Buffers, as Sal noted, are widely accepted and often required, and widths are informed by vision, goals, objectives that are contained in strategic plans, but also in key approved policy documents. Policies often provide for refinement, either increase or decrease. We heard from you through the polling that from some of you indicated from your perspective that the agricultural policies need to be clarified. but that there is some degree of uncertainty as to whether or not the policies, in fact, currently support the agricultural industry. Two of you indicated you really didn't know. With respect to providing additional information regarding NPCA roles and responsibilities, you noted through the poll that there are a constellation of opportunities for NPCA to provide additional knowledge, information, insight about the role that they provide and the work that they do from a planning, permitting, application requirements perspective. There was overwhelming support from you when we asked you a question about whether or not it would be helpful to identify who does what with respect to natural heritage outside of NPCA regulated areas. You also suggested through the polling that there is an opportunity, many opportunities, to improve the areas that NPCA focuses on by ensuring that, first of all, policy is being driven by science where it is available, that there are up-to-date policies that are indeed readily available and accessible to all, that there is an opportunity for NPCA to develop and utilize a decision to support tool for establishing buffer widths, and also for creating stronger partnerships with watershed municipalities. During our Q&A, you cited a number of thoughts, suggestions, concerns, and observations, and you said that you had a number of concerns and as well as comments. NPCA needs to think about adopting a systems approach and perhaps prominently recognizing that. Recognize that the PPS, Linda, to your point, is a minimum or low bar, and NPCA needs to do better from a policy lens. As was suggested, focus on, by Dave, focus on the impacts of climate change on floodplain mapping, and also think about fighting and how to through David suggested, fight the MZOs and ensure that sensitive areas are actually addressed from an NPCA lens. As said, and you also raised a number of concerns around biodiversity offsetting. Again, Lyndon, duly noted from you. I can't do justice, as said, to all of the comments. Those are some of the key learnings and critical thoughts that I heard and saw in text through the Q&A. It's certainly been, from my perspective, a pleasure to have had the opportunity to share some time with you. At this time, I'm going to turn the microphone back to Leilani to provide some final commentary and to close the meeting. Leilani, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Karen, and a huge thank you to everyone who joined the webinar today, who listened to the information that we shared with you, who shared their insights, their comments with us today. We'd like to continue hearing from you. We have the online survey that we have on the Get Involved page. We're also welcoming written comments to our dedicated email address for the project, policy_review@mpca.ca. As Karen noted, the copy of the webinar will be posted on the Get Involved page. We're asking for comments by September 9th. We'd like an opportunity to be able to digest the information and comments that we receive in order to inform the direction we will go with any new policies or looking at any new tools or standards or processes that we should consider and put in place for the procedural manual. So again, thank you everybody for taking the time tonight. 2 hours is a big commitment of your day, and we thank you very much. And if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to send them to our policy project email address, and we'll get back to you. So thank you again, everyone, on behalf of NPCA.